Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet journey through time. Tonight, we drift back to the days of the Roman Empire, not to the clamor of battle, but to the gentle rhythm of a soldier's life in peacetime. Imagine the warmth of the Mediterranean sun, the slow clinking of tools, the murmur of distant conversations in a camp at rest. No shouts of war tonight, only the soft hum of daily life in the legions. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let this story carry you away into the peaceful past. The life of a Roman legionary in peacetime was far from the chaos of war. Instead, it was structured, predictable, and often surprisingly tranquil. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the camp would stir, not with the urgency of battle, but with the quiet routine of men who knew their duties well. The air carried the scent of damp earth and the faint smoke of morning fires. Legionaries rose from their simple cots, stretching stiff muscles before pulling on their well-worn tunics. Breakfast was a modest affair: coarse bread, a little cheese, perhaps some olives or dried figs. There was no rush. The centurion might walk among the men, exchanging a few words, checking that all was in order. The sound of grinding wheat from nearby mills mixed with the distant calls of birds greeting the day. Once the sun had fully risen, the legionaries moved into their daily tasks. In peacetime, a soldier's work was often that of a laborer, an engineer, or even a craftsman. Some would be assigned to repair roads, smoothing stones into place with careful, repetitive motions. Others might work on fortifications, stacking bricks or mixing mortar in the slow, methodical way of men who had done this 100 times before. The sound of chisels on stone, the scrape of shovels in dirt, the murmur of conversation. These were the sounds of a legion at peace. Occasionally, a soldier might pause to wipe his brow, taking a moment to gaze at the landscape rolling out before him. There was no enemy here, only the quiet beauty of the empire they helped maintain. By midday, the heat would grow heavy and the pace of work slowed. Some men retreated to the shade of their tents, while others gathered in small groups to share stories or play simple games. Dice carved from bone clattered on wooden boards, and laughter, soft, unhurried, drifted through the camp. A few might take the time to write letters home, carefully etching words onto wax tablets. The act was slow, deliberate, each stroke of the stylus a connection to distant loved ones. There was no urgency, only the quiet satisfaction of a task done well. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the camp settled into its evening rhythm. The scent of stew, barley, lentils, perhaps a little salted meat, filled the air. Men gathered around fires, eating in companionable silence or sharing quiet jokes. The centurion might make his rounds once more, ensuring all was well before nightfall. There were no alarms, no sudden calls to arms, just the steady, reassuring routine of a life lived in peace. And as the stars began to appear, the legionaries would retreat to their cots. The sounds of the night, crickets, the occasional owl, the soft rustle of the wind, lulling them to sleep. When war was distant, a legionary's skills extended far beyond the battlefield. Many soldiers were trained in crafts that kept the empire running, repairing armor, forging nails, even carving wood into useful tools. In a quiet corner of the camp, you might find a veteran legionary bent over a workbench, carefully hammering out a dent in a helmet. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his mallet was a sound of patience, not urgency. Nearby, another soldier rubbed oil into a leather belt, his hands moving in slow, circular motions. The scent of linseed oil and beeswax hung in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the workshop. The blacksmith's forge was a place of warmth and steady labor. In peacetime, the legion smiths spent their days mending hinges, shaping horseshoes, and crafting the small iron hooks that held tents together. The fire glowed a deep orange, its heat radiating gently into the cool morning air. A smith might pause to wipe his brow, then return to his work, pumping the bellows in a slow, even rhythm. The hiss of hot metal plunged into water was a familiar sound, one that spoke of routine rather than haste. Occasionally, a curious young soldier would linger, watching as the smith transformed raw iron into something useful. There was no shouting here, only the quiet exchange of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Even in peacetime, sentries stood watch, but their duty was more about observation than alarm. At the camp's gates, a legionary might lean on his spear, gazing at the distant horizon where farmland met sky. There was little to fear, and so the hours passed in quiet contemplation. He might watch a shepherd guiding his flock across a far-off hill, or trace the path of clouds drifting overhead. Sometimes, a traveling merchant would approach, leading a donkey laden with wine or spices, and the sentry would exchange a few words before waving him through. The slow passage of time was not a burden, but a gift, a chance to let the mind wander, to daydream of home, or simply to exist in the stillness of the moment. Few remember that some legionaries were also artists. With long stretches of idle time, soldiers carved intricate designs into their shield grips, scratched small drawings onto pottery shards, or even painted murals on barrack walls. One might find a soldier sitting cross-legged in the shade, a knife in hand, carefully etching the figure of a god or a lucky charm into a piece of bone. His movements were slow, deliberate, each stroke a meditation. Nearby, another man dipped a brush into homemade pigment, adding color to a makeshift fresco of a pastoral scene. These were not masterpieces, but they were personal, a way to leave a mark on the world that wasn't made with a sword. As evening fell, the camp returned to its gentle routines. Men gathered to sharpen blades, not for battle, but for the simple satisfaction of maintaining their tools. The sound of whetstones gliding over steel was rhythmic, almost musical. Others took time to mend their cloaks, stitching up tiers with thick, even threads. Conversation was sparse, but warm. A story about home, a joke about the centurion's stubborn mule, a shared memory of a festival in Rome. And when the last light faded, the legionaries would once again retreat to their cots, the day's quiet labors behind them. In the stillness between campaigns, bonds between soldiers grew deep and enduring. Veterans would take new recruits under their wing, teaching them not just swordplay, but the unspoken rules of camp life, how to mend gear properly, which merchants gave fair prices, where to find the best spot to watch the sunset over the walls. These relationships were built through countless small moments, sharing extra rations with a homesick young soldier, covering a comrade's watch when he was ill, passing along a well-worn pair of boots to someone whose own had worn through. The centurions generally turned a blind eye to these quiet acts of kindness, understanding that such bonds made for a stronger legion. For many legionaries, the most precious moments came when the imperial post arrived. Men who could read would often gather small groups around them in the evenings, slowly sounding out messages from home. The scratch of a stylus on wax tablets filled the air as soldiers dictated replies to literate comrades. These letters followed predictable patterns: inquiries about family health, updates about village gossip, assurances that the sender was safe and well-fed. What went unsaid often spoke loudest. The careful avoidance of battle details, the way a soldier might describe local scenery rather than his duties, the extra care taken with the handwriting when mentioning a loved one. Peacetime service developed its own comforting rhythms. Each morning after breakfast, the options would call the roll in the same cadence they'd used for years. Supply days came predictably every 8 days, when soldiers would line up patiently for their measured portions of grain, oil, and salt. Even the drills took on a meditative quality in absence of imminent battle. The familiar clatter of practice weapons, the well-worn commands called out in sequence, the muscle memory of formations practiced until they could be performed half asleep, these were the lullabies of garrison life. When the calendar marked festivals, even frontier posts found ways to observe them. Soldiers would pool their coins to buy better wine, or improvise decorations from local flowers and spare cloth. A particularly talented legionary might attempt to recreate traditional dishes using local ingredients. The results sometimes delicious, often amusingly inauthentic. Birthdays were quietly acknowledged. A shared piece of honey cake saved from town, an extra cup of wine, perhaps a small carved token. These celebrations were simple affairs, but all the more precious for their rarity in a soldier's life. With no enemy threatening, soldiers found ways to fill the long afternoons. Some took up whittling, producing an endless array of wooden toys and figurines. Others played intricate board games, scratched in a stone or marked in the dirt. wagering small trinkets rather than coins. The truly ambitious might attempt to learn an instrument, filling the camp with the halting notes of beginners until their comrades good-naturedly begged them to practice elsewhere. These were the hours when soldiers became individuals again, rather than just parts of the Great War Machine. Every eighth day, the space before the Principia transformed into a bustling marketplace. Local farmers would arrive at dawn, their carts creaking under the weight of fresh produce. Legionaries moved slowly between stalls, fingering ripe figs and sampling wedges of cheese. The air smelled of fresh bread, smoked fish, and the earthy scent of turned soil. Seasoned soldiers knew all the tricks: which vendor's olive oil was worth the extra coins, when to arrive for the best selection of apricots, how to haggle politely in broken local dialects. Young recruits trailed behind their centurions, learning these peacetime skills as carefully as they'd been taught to wield a gladius. Just beyond official boundaries, small taverns sprang up like mushrooms after rain. These establishments had their own rhythms. The morning rush of soldiers grabbing quick breakfasts, the lazy afternoons when old veterans played dice games that stretched for hours, the lively evenings when songs from a dozen provinces mingled in the smoky air. The better tavern keepers knew their customers by name and custom, keeping the strong Egyptian beer for the veterans who preferred it, reserving the corner bench for the scribe who came to write letters, always having a bowl of broth ready for the sentry finishing the night watch. During long postings, many legionaries learned civilian trades. A soldier might spend his free days apprenticing with a local blacksmith, exchanging labor for lessons in finer metalwork. Others helped harvest grapes or olives, their military discipline making them valued seasonal workers. These cross-cultural exchanges flowed both ways. Local potters adopted Roman designs, bakers experimented with new grains from distant provinces, and children played games using Latin counting rhymes. The legion's doctors, always in demand, often held informal clinics for civilians after treating their own men. As postings stretched into years, many soldiers formed bonds that went beyond friendship. Some married local women, setting up households in the settlements that grew around permanent camps. Their children played in the streets, speaking a mix of Latin and local dialects, climbing on abandoned siege engines as if they were playground equipment. On rest days, these family men could be seen carrying toddlers on their shoulders to the baths or teaching their sons to swim in nearby rivers. The strict military hierarchy softened somewhat for these veterans. Centurions often looked the other way when they slipped out after evening roll call to kiss their children goodnight. The empire's greatest gift to many soldiers wasn't gold or land, but language. Legionaries stationed for years in Gaul found themselves dreaming in Celtic, those posted to the east bargaining fluently in Greek. The camp's morning greetings became a linguistic tapestry, a salute called in Latin, the response in Dacian, a joke shouted back in Iberian accented slang. This verbal alchemy happened gradually, almost unnoticed. A soldier would realize one day that he'd automatically switched languages when buying bread, or that local children no longer giggled at his pronunciation. These were the quiet victories of peacetime service. In every century, there were always a few legionaries who carried more than weapons in their packs. A well-worn scroll of Virgil, a Greek treatise on mathematics, or wax tablets filled with personal musings might accompany them from posting to posting. These men often became informal teachers during winter months, leading reading circles in dimly lit barracks. There was an unexpected poetry to garrison life that many soldiers came to cherish. The predictable rhythm of dawn drills, the geometric perfection of a properly arranged tent line, even the soothing repetition of polishing armor. These routines became meditative practices. Some legionaries developed small rituals to mark time's passage, always stopping to watch the sunset from the western gate, saving the ripest fig for market day for their tent mate, or making the same joke each time they oiled their sword. These tiny traditions created meaning in the long stretch of years. Far from Rome's bustling streets, many soldiers developed unique worldviews blending stoic discipline with frontier pragmatism. Night watch rotations became opportunities for contemplation under star-filled skies. The constant presence of death made life's simple pleasures more precious. The first taste of spring water after a long march, the warmth of new woolen socks in winter. Veterans often shared these hard-won philosophies with younger soldiers. Complain about the rain, and you'll always be miserable. A dry crust shared tastes better than a feast alone. The man who can sleep anywhere owns the world. Some legionaries became meticulous record keepers of their postings, using whatever materials were at hand. The margins of supply lists, cheap papyrus, even smooth patches of dirt. They noted everything from local weather patterns to the strange customs of frontier tribes. These unofficial histories often contain surprisingly personal details. Today the river rose 3 handspans overnight. The Thracian auxiliaries taught us a new drinking song. First snowfall came early this year. Remember my brother's birthday because of it. In these small notations, the true texture of military life emerged. In the absence of grand temples, many soldiers developed personal spiritual practices. A lucky coin tucked in a belt pouch, a small altar to Mithras in the corner of a tent, the careful observance of flight patterns before battle. These small devotions sustained them. The most thoughtful legionaries often blended beliefs from different cultures they'd encountered. A Gaulish cavalryman might make offerings to both Epona and the Roman genius of his unit. A Syrian archer could be seen touching his forehead, lips and heart before meals in quiet homage to multiple traditions. After 25 years of service, a legionary's duties gradually shifted from active campaigning to mentoring. These silver-haired warriors became the living memory of their units, teaching not just combat skills, but the subtle arts of peacetime soldering, how to negotiate with local merchants, which herbs could ease a camp cough, the tricks for making garrison bread more palatable. Their presence brought continuity to ever-changing rosters. New recruits learned to recognize these veterans by the particular way they oiled their armor or tied their sandals. Small rituals perfected over decades of service. When discharge papers finally came, the ceremony was surprisingly simple, yet deeply moving. In the morning formation, the veteran would step forward one last time to hear his service read aloud. His well-worn sword and armor were ceremonially returned, replaced with a civilian toga and the precious bronze diploma that granted citizenship and pension rights. Many retirees chose to settle near their old postings, opening small businesses or farming land grants. Former engineers became builders, medics opened herbal shops, and cavalrymen bred horses. Their military pensions provided modest but steady incomes, usually paid in 3 annual installments of good silver coins. These communities of veterans created pockets of Roman culture across the provinces. One could walk into their taverns and hear a dozen accents blending together, see children playing with miniature legionary standards, smell bread baked to the exact recipe used in camp ovens. Even in retirement, old soldiers maintained their routines. Many rose at dawn from habit, folded their blankets with military precision, and took daily walks along roads they'd once patrolled. Some volunteered to train local militias. Others became storytellers at village gatherings. When one of their number passed, his former comrades would gather to give him a proper send-off, placing coins on his eyes for sharing his best stories, and ensuring his grave marker recorded his years of faithful service. The rites were simple but deeply felt. The true impact of these peacetime soldiers became visible generations later. Their grandchildren spoke Latin alongside local dialects. Their building techniques influenced regional architecture, and their hybrid traditions became part of provincial culture. The empire endured not just through conquest, but through these quiet acts of daily living. Archaeologists would later find traces of their lives. A love letter scratched on a shard of pottery, a child's wooden toy sword, a well-worn stylus buried with its owner. Each artifact whispering stories of ordinary men who helped build an extraordinary civilization.